The gavel hadn't even fallen yet, and I could already feel every eye in that courtroom sliding toward me like I was something they'd scraped off a shoe. My brother's lawyer stood there in his $3,000 suit pointing at me like I was a line item on a spreadsheet. The judge actually smirked like this was already decided. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, that same smug tilt to his chin he'd had since we were kids. He thought he'd won. He thought I was going to sit there and take it. He had no idea who he was talking to. "Your Honor, she can't even pay her own bills." Daniel said it like it was a mic drop, like the words alone should have been enough to end the hearing right there. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He looked at the judge, at the gallery, at the two reporters from the local business journal who'd shown up because a $36 million estate dispute was apparently good copy for a slow Tuesday. He looked at everyone except me because looking at me might have reminded him that I was still his sister, and not just an obstacle standing between him and our father's company. I sat at the plaintiff's table. Correction, the defendant's table, since somehow in the span of 3 weeks I had gone from grieving daughter to legal defendant, wearing the plainest gray blazer I owned. I'd landed at Reagan National at 6 that morning, taken a commercial flight because military transport wasn't exactly available for personal legal matters, and I hadn't had time to change into anything that said I was somebody. I looked like exactly what Daniel wanted the judge to see, a tired woman in a wrinkled blazer who couldn't be bothered to dress for her own future. His lawyer, a slick silver-haired man named Preston Hale, continued laying it out. He explained with theatrical patience that my sister here, gesturing at me without using my name, as if my name might humanize me too much, had spent the last 15 years living off what he called a government paycheck. He used air quotes. He actually used air quotes in a courtroom like my entire career was a punchline he'd rehearsed in the mirror. "She has no business background," he said. "No experience managing assets of this scale. No demonstrated financial acumen whatsoever. Meanwhile, my client has built an 8-figure real estate portfolio from the ground up. The choice here isn't complicated, Your Honor." The judge nodded along, slow and deliberate, the way people nod when they've already made up their mind and are just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He glanced at me over his glasses, and I watched him take in the blazer, the flight rumpled hair, the exhaustion I hadn't quite managed to hide. I watched him file me away into a category before I'd said a single word. Daniel's petition asked the court to grant him full and immediate control over the entire Collins family trust, every logistics contract, every property, every dollar our father had spent 4 decades building. He wanted it locked down before probate even finished, wanted the judge to declare in writing that his sister lacked the capacity to serve in any fiduciary role whatsoever. Not shared control, not oversight. Total unquestioned command with me, formally and permanently written out. I didn't move. I didn't flinch, didn't sigh, didn't reach for the water glass in front of me even though my throat had gone dry the moment Daniel opened his mouth. 15 years of briefings in rooms with far higher stakes than this one had taught me that stillness is its own kind of language. People read panic into fidgeting. They read guilt into defensiveness. I had learned a long time ago that silence unsettles people far more than they expect, especially people who are used to being answered. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been since we buried our father, since I stood at that graveside in my dress uniform because I hadn't had time to pack anything else, since Daniel had barely waited for the funeral flowers to wilt before filing this petition. 3 weeks, and already he'd frozen my access to the family accounts. Already he'd told anyone who'd listen that I was a burden he was finally free to shed. I thought about my father a lot in that courtroom. Not the version everyone else remembered, not the boardroom tactician who built a logistics empire from 3 trucks and a warehouse lease. I thought about the man who used to call me late at night, voice low, so Daniel wouldn't hear, asking what I thought about a shipping contract or a board member he didn't trust. The man who told me more than once in that steady tone he only used when he meant something completely. Don't argue. When the time comes, the truth will speak for itself. I hadn't understood what he meant back then. I understood it now, sitting in that chair, letting Daniel's lawyer paint me as helpless while I said absolutely nothing in my own defense. Some fights aren't won with objections. Some fights are won by letting the other side talk themselves into a corner. Preston Hale finished his statement with a flourish, thanked the court, and sat down looking entirely too pleased with himself. Daniel exhaled like a man who'd already collected his prize. The judge shuffled his papers, glanced at the clock, then finally turned his attention to the side of the room he'd been ignoring for the better part of 20 minutes. He looked at me, really looked for the first time since the hearing began. "Ms. Collins," he said, not unkindly, but with the flat procedural tone of a man checking a box before ruling. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" I felt Daniel's eyes on me. I felt the whole room lean in, waiting for me to fold. I set my hands flat on the table and I stood up. Nobody in that courtroom understood why I was the way I was, why I could sit through an accusation like that without so much as a raised eyebrow, why I'd let my own brother call me financially incompetent in front of strangers without correcting him. To understand that you'd have to go back almost 20 years to a house in Alexandria, where two very different children grew up under the same roof and somehow came out believing entirely different things about what mattered. Our father, Richard Collins, built Collins Freight Solutions out of 3 second-hand trucks and a warehouse he could barely afford to lease. By the time Daniel and I were teenagers, it had grown into a regional logistics powerhouse. And by the time our father turned 60, it was worth $36 million on paper, with contracts stretching from the Port of Baltimore to distribution hubs across 4 states. Daniel was the older child, the assumed heir from the moment he could talk. He shadowed our father at board meetings starting in high school. He interned in the logistics office every summer. Everyone, including our father in those early years, assumed the company would eventually be his. I went a different direction. I enlisted after college against everyone's wishes, against every argument my father's business partners threw at the dinner table about wasted potential and squandered opportunity. Daniel took it personally, like my choosing the Army was some kind of rejection of the family, of him, of everything Collins Freight represented. He never said it kindly. He said it the way older brothers say things when they want them to sting. "You just know how to salute," he told me once at a Christmas dinner when I was maybe 25, home on leave for 4 days. He said it with a laugh, like it was a joke between siblings, but there was no warmth underneath it. Our father hadn't laughed. He'd just watched me carefully, the way he always did, like he was measuring something the rest of the room couldn't see. The truth was, I was almost never home after that. Deployments, training, rotations, postings that couldn't be discussed, even with family assignments that came with clearance levels I couldn't explain over a dinner table. I missed birthdays. I missed holidays. I missed the slow accumulation of ordinary family moments that build the kind of closeness Daniel had with our parents, simply because I was somewhere else doing something I wasn't allowed to talk about, becoming someone my own family didn't recognize. Our mother passed when I was 28, a fast and brutal cancer that took her in under a year. I got emergency leave for the funeral, and then I was gone again, back to a base overseas, back to a life that looked like abandonment from the outside, even though it never felt that way to me. Daniel stayed. Daniel ran the local charity gala in her memory. Daniel became, in every visible way, the child who showed up. What nobody knew, what I never told Daniel, what our father asked me specifically not to mention, was that he and I never stopped talking. Not really. There were calls sometimes at strange hours because of time zone differences, where he'd walk me through a contract dispute or a supplier conflict, and ask almost sheepishly what I thought. At first I assumed he was just being polite, humoring the daughter who'd chosen a different path. But the questions got more specific over the years. He asked about risk exposure on a shipping contract in the Gulf. He asked about vendor diversification after a single supplier nearly cost the company 2 major accounts. He asked about liability structures, about how the military handled contractor accountability, about frameworks I'd learned managing logistics chains worth more than his entire company. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought he was lonely maybe, or missing me in his own guarded way, using business as an excuse to keep a thread of connection open between us. It wasn't until years later that I understood what those calls actually were. He wasn't humoring me. He was quietly, deliberately relying on me, using my judgment on decisions that shaped the company's direction for years, decisions Daniel never knew I had any part in. There was a shipping contract in 2019 that Daniel pushed hard for an expansion into a new regional carrier that looked great on paper and terrible underneath it. Our father called me at 2 a.m, his time walked me through the terms, and I told him exactly what was wrong with the liability clauses, exactly what would happen if that carrier defaulted mid-contract. He killed the deal the next morning. Daniel was furious. He never knew why our father changed his mind so suddenly. He assumed it was instinct or age or fear. It wasn't. It was me 3,000 miles away doing the only kind of work for this family I was ever quietly allowed to do. Our father never told him. I think looking back, he was protecting something, not me exactly, but some idea of fairness he hadn't figured out how to make real yet. He let Daniel believe he'd built his confidence in the company alone. He let me stay invisible, the daughter who chose the army over the family business, the one who couldn't be bothered to show up. What none of us knew, what none of us could have known sitting around that dinner table all those Christmases, was that our father had been quietly building something else entirely behind the scenes, something that had almost nothing to do with who worked in the office every day, and everything to do with who he actually trusted with what mattered most. The funeral was smaller than I expected. Our father had built an empire, but he'd never been a man who wanted a spectacle made of his death, and so it was just family. A handful of longtime employees and the lawyer who'd handled Collins Freight's affairs for over 20 years, a careful gray-suited man named Arthur Wexler, who kept glancing at Daniel with an expression I couldn't quite read. I flew in on emergency leave, buried my father in my dress uniform because there hadn't been time to pack anything else, and within 72 hours I understood exactly how quickly grief could be weaponized by someone who'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. Daniel moved fast, faster than seemed possible for a man who was supposedly mourning. Within a week, he'd installed himself in our father's old office, moved the nameplate, changed the passwords on the shared financial accounts, and quietly redirected the automatic transfers that used to cover incidental family expenses, the kind of small distributions our father had always sent my way without ceremony. A little help here and there for a sister who'd spent her adult life on a government salary in some of the most expensive cities in the country. I didn't ask for those distributions to stop. Daniel simply stopped them the way you'd cancel a subscription you decided you no longer wanted to pay for. My apartment lease in Arlington came due, my car payment came due, a dental bill I'd been putting off finally landed in my inbox with a late notice attached. None of it was catastrophic. I had savings. I had my salary. I wasn't actually in danger of losing anything, but the timing was surgical. Daniel knew exactly which accounts to freeze, and exactly how long it would take before the disruption became visible, became something he could point to. I heard through our father's longtime executive assistant that Daniel had said it plainly to one of the board members over drinks. If she can't handle a few bills disappearing, that tells you everything you need to know about whether she could handle $36 million. He wasn't hiding his strategy. He was proud of it. He thought he was being clever engineering a crisis that would prove his point before anyone even had to argue it. What Daniel didn't know I didn't fully understand myself until Arthur Wexler called me 11 days after the funeral and asked me to come to his office alone, was that our father had never actually left the company's future in the hands of a simple will. Arthur sat me down in a conference room with dark wood paneling and a view of the Potomac, closed the door, and told me something that changed the entire shape of what I thought was happening. "Your father restructured the estate 4 years ago," he said. "Everything sits inside a family trust now. Daniel has been operating as interim executor since his passing, which gives him day-to-day authority over operations. But that authority was never permanent, Victoria, and it was never unconditional." I asked him what he meant. "The trust names a permanent successor trustee," Arthur said. "Someone with full and final authority over the estate, superseding Daniel's interim role entirely. Your father sealed that designation. It was only meant to be opened if a dispute arose over control of the trust." I felt something shift in my chest, something between dread and disbelief. "Has a dispute arisen?" Arthur slid a folder across the table, and inside it was a copy of the petition Daniel had just filed in probate court, asking the judge to formally strip me of any claim to involvement in the estate and grant him unconditional permanent control. "He just triggered it," Arthur said quietly. "He doesn't know it yet, but by filing this, he's opened the very document he should have been terrified of." I sat with that for a long moment, staring at Daniel's signature at the bottom of the petition, at his lawyer's aggressive language about my supposed incompetence, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel since the funeral, not grief, not anger, but a strange, quiet clarity. My father had seen this coming. Somehow, in some way, I didn't yet understand he had anticipated exactly this moment, and he had built a mechanism to answer it. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked. "Because your father was explicit," Arthur said. "The letter stays sealed unless there's a formal legal dispute. He didn't want either of you making decisions based on what was inside it. He wanted this decided on its own terms first." He paused. He also said, and I'm quoting him directly, that if Daniel ever tried to force the issue in court, the truth would need to come out exactly the way he designed it, in front of a judge, not at a dinner table. I thought about every call my father and I had ever had, every late-night question about liability and risk, every decision he made, that Daniel assumed came from his own instincts. I thought about the calm, deliberate way my father had operated his entire life, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room, including his own children. Daniel had spent 3 weeks trying to prove I was unfit to manage anything. He had frozen my accounts, spread doubts among the board, dragged me into a courtroom to make his case in front of a stranger with a gavel. He thought he was building an airtight argument. He had no idea he was walking directly into the one trap our father had spent years constructing, patient enough to wait until the moment his son couldn't help himself. I left Arthur's office that afternoon with the folder under my arm and a strange, steady calm settling over me. The same calm I used to feel before a high-stakes briefing when I knew I'd done the preparation, and all that was left was to walk into the room. Daniel wanted a fight. He was about to get one. He simply had no idea it had already been decided 4 years before he ever filed the paperwork. Back in the courtroom, the air felt different than it had 3 weeks earlier when this whole thing started, though. Nothing about the room itself had changed. Same dark paneling. Same tired, fluorescent hum overhead. Same judge, a heavyset man named Judge Halloran, who'd clearly presided over 100 estate disputes just like this one, and had long since stopped expecting any of them to surprise him. Daniel had spent the better part of the morning building his case methodically, confidently, the way a man builds something he's certain won't be questioned. He'd brought in a financial consultant who testified to his portfolio's performance over the last decade. He'd brought in a former Collins Freight Board member who spoke glowingly about Daniel's operational instincts. His lawyer, Preston Hale, walked the judge through spreadsheet after spreadsheet, projection after projection, painting a picture of a capable, seasoned businessman ready to steer a $36 million company into its next chapter. My lawyer, a quiet, unassuming woman named Renee Ashford, whom Arthur had recommended, said almost nothing. She asked a handful of clarifying questions, declined to cross-examine most of Daniel's witnesses, and generally gave the impression of a defense that had nothing substantial to offer. I watched Judge Halloran's posture shift over the course of the morning, watched him lean more toward Daniel's side of the room, watched him nod along to Preston Hale's closing points with something close to agreement. By early afternoon, it was clear the momentum belonged entirely to my brother. I could feel it in the room, that particular texture of a courtroom when everyone quietly assumes they already know how the ruling will go. Daniel felt it too. He kept glancing at me with something between pity and satisfaction, like he was already composing the apology he wouldn't actually give me once this was over. The estate deserves a steward who has spent his entire adult life mastering finance assets and growth. Preston Hale said, wrapping his closing argument with a flourish, clearly rehearsed for exactly this moment. Not someone who has spent that same time entirely removed from the family business, entirely removed, frankly, from any demonstrated understanding of what it takes to run an enterprise of this scale. Judge Halloran nodded, made a note, and then turned to my side of the room. "Ms. Ashford, does the defense have anything further?" Renee glanced at me. This was the moment we'd discussed the night before, the moment she'd told me was mine and mine alone to take. "My client would like to address the court directly, Your Honor," she said. I stood. The room did that thing rooms do when they expect someone to fold, a kind of collective stillness, people leaning slightly forward, anticipating tears and apology, some plea for a smaller share of what my brother was trying to take entirely. Daniel actually smiled. I saw it, that same smile from the Christmas dinner table 20 years earlier, the one that said he already knew how this ended. I didn't reach for notes. I didn't need them. "Your Honor, my name is Victoria Collins," I said, and my voice came out steady, the same steady I'd used delivering briefings to men with far more stars on their shoulders than anyone in this room. but I go by a different name in most rooms I walk into. Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Collins, United States Army. I heard Daniel exhale a short, dismissive breath like the rank itself was supposed to mean nothing to him. He actually let out a small laugh, quiet but audible, the kind of laugh that says, "So what?" For the last 6 years, I continued, I've served as a senior logistics and acquisitions advisor at the Pentagon, currently attached to a joint program office, responsible for sustainment contracts across 3 combatant commands. Before that, I spent 4 years overseeing multinational supply chain operations, supporting deployed forces in 2 theaters. My work involves managing acquisition portfolios, evaluating vendor risk, and advising senior leadership on budget allocations that, in aggregate, exceed $11 billion annually. The room had gone very quiet. Judge Halloran's pen had stopped moving. "I don't say this to embarrass my brother," I said, and I meant it even though every part of the last 3 weeks had made that harder to believe than it should have been. I say it because the court has spent all morning hearing an argument built entirely on the idea that I lack any relevant experience managing complex financial systems. I'd like the record to reflect otherwise. I handed Renee a folder and she carried it forward to the bench. My federal appointment documentation program oversight assignments with dollar figures attached a letter of commendation from a 2-star general regarding a contract restructuring I'd led that saved the Department of Defense over $90 million in a single fiscal year. Judge Halloran took his time with it, flipping through the pages slowly, his expression shifting from polite neutrality into something more careful, more attentive. "Ms. Collins," he said, finally glancing up at me, "you've managed budget authority significantly larger than the estate in question." "Yes, Your Honor, considerably larger." Preston Hale rose, flustered, trying to interject something about relevance about how military logistics experience didn't necessarily translate to private estate management, but his voice had lost the smooth confidence from earlier. Daniel wasn't laughing anymore. He was staring at the folder in the judge's hands like it had personally betrayed him. "I kept my career private from my family for a long time." I continued before the judge could rule on the objection. "Partly because much of the work involves information I'm not able to discuss. Partly because I never felt the need to prove anything to anyone at a dinner table. But I understand now that this court needs to see clearly who it's actually deciding between." Judge Halloran set the folder down, removed his glasses, and looked at me for a long moment, with an expression that had changed entirely from the one he'd worn 3 weeks earlier, the one that had dismissed me before I'd even opened my mouth. "This changes the complexion of these proceedings considerably," he said, more to himself than to the room. He looked toward Arthur Wexler, seated quietly near the back. "Counselor, I understand there may be additional documentation from the decedent himself relevant to succession." Arthur rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'd like to enter into evidence a sealed letter left by Richard Collins, along with the formal trust documentation naming his intended successor trustee." Daniel's head snapped toward his own lawyer, confusion and alarm crossing his face for the first time all day. "What sealed letter?" he said, not quite a question, more a demand, his voice cracking slightly at the edges. "Nobody said anything about a sealed letter." Judge Halloran looked at him evenly. "Mr. Collins, it appears there's a great deal about your father's intentions that hasn't yet made it into this courtroom. Mr. Wexler, you may proceed." Arthur Wexler carried the envelope forward like it weighed more than paper should. It was cream-colored, sealed with a strip of red wax our father had used on important documents his entire life, a habit he picked up decades ago from some old business partner and never let go of. I recognized that wax the second Arthur held it up for the court to see. My chest tightened in a way it hadn't all day, not during Daniel's testimony, not during my own. "Your Honor, this letter was written by Richard Collins 8 months before his passing, during a period when he was already aware of his declining health," Arthur said. "It was notarized, witnessed, and filed alongside the trust documentation with explicit instructions that it only be opened in the event of a formal dispute over trusteeship." Judge Halloran nodded. "Proceed." Arthur broke the seal, carefully unfolded 3 pages of our father's handwriting, and began to read. I recognized the handwriting instantly, the particular slant of his letters, the way he crossed his sevens, the old-fashioned way, a habit from some engineering course decades ago that had never left him. To whoever is reading this in a courtroom. Arthur read, "I want to say first that if we've reached this point, I'm disappointed, though not entirely surprised. I built Collins Freight from nothing, because I believed effort and vision mattered more than where you started. I hoped I'd raise 2 children who understood that legacy isn't a prize to be fought over. It seems at least one of you needed a stronger lesson." Daniel's jaw tightened. He was staring straight ahead, refusing to look at me, refusing to look at anyone. Arthur continued, "Daniel, you have always had extraordinary instincts for growth. You saw opportunities before anyone else did, and much of what this company became in the last 15 years is thanks to your ambition. I am proud of that, and I want you to know it plainly because I don't think I said it enough while I was alive. But ambition without restraint becomes something dangerous. And over the years I watched you treat the company's resources as an extension of yourself rather than something you were entrusted to protect on behalf of everyone who depends on it." The room was silent except for Arthur's steady voice. "Victoria," he read, and my name in my father's words spoken aloud in that courtroom hit differently than I expected. "You never once asked me for anything. Not when you enlisted against everyone's wishes. Not when your mother passed and you had to fly back to a life none of us understood. Not during the years I called you at strange hours asking for advice I was too proud to admit I needed. You gave me honesty every single time without ever asking what it would cost you. And you never once used those conversations to position yourself for anything. I don't think you even realized what you were doing. I did." I felt my throat tighten. I kept my hands folded in front of me, kept my spine straight, the same discipline that had carried me through every difficult briefing of my career, now carrying me through this. There was a contract in 2019 that could have cost this company everything. Arthur continued reading. "Daniel pushed hard for it. Victoria, from 3,000 miles away with no financial stake in the outcome, told me exactly what was wrong with it, and she was right. There have been other moments like that over the years, more than either of you know. Daniel built the company's growth. Victoria protected it from itself over and over without credit and without complaint." Daniel's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I could see him recalculating the confidence from that morning draining out of his posture in real time. "I am naming Victoria Collins as sole successor trustee of the Collins Family Trust, effective immediately upon any formal dispute regarding trusteeship." Arthur read, his voice steady and clear. "This designation supersedes any interim authority previously granted to Daniel Collins. Victoria will have full and final authority over all trust assets, including but not limited to Collins Freight Solutions and all associated holdings." A murmur moved through the gallery. Daniel's head dropped slightly like something in his neck had given out. "I want to be clear that this is not a punishment," Arthur continued reading. "This is a recognition of who has consistently protected this family's future without asking anything in return. Daniel, I hope in time you'll understand this decision the way I intended it. Victoria, thank you for never once asking for a single dollar. You never had to. You already gave more than money could measure." Arthur set the pages down gently on the bench in front of Judge Halloran, then stepped back. The courtroom stayed quiet for a long moment. Judge Halloran read through the notarized trust amendment himself, cross-referencing dates, signatures, witness statements, his expression unreadable as he worked through each page. Preston Hale leaned over to whisper something to Daniel, but Daniel wasn't responding. He sat completely still, staring at the table in front of him, at his own folded hands, at nothing at all. I didn't feel triumphant. That surprised me. Sitting there in that moment, I'd technically just won. I felt something closer to grief resurfacing, sharper than it had been at the funeral. Because hearing my father's voice in that letter made his absence suddenly physically real again, in a way 3 weeks of legal maneuvering had somehow kept at a distance. Judge Halloran finally looked up. "This document appears facially valid, properly executed and witnessed. Mr. Wexler, I'll want your office to submit the full trust file for the record, but based on what's been entered today, this changes the fundamental question before this court." He turned to Daniel, and his tone had shifted entirely from the polite deference he'd shown that morning. Mr. Collins, it appears the court needs to examine not just the question of succession, but the conduct of the current interim executor during the period leading up to this hearing. I'm going to want a full accounting of trust disbursements over the last several weeks before we proceed further. Daniel's head came up slowly. For the first time since I'd walked into that courtroom, he looked afraid. The accounting took 4 days. Judge Halloran ordered an emergency forensic audit of every trust account Daniel had touched since our father's death, and he assigned it to an independent court-appointed examiner named Diane Kestler, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd spent 20 years untangling exactly these kinds of disputes. I sat through most of it in Renee's office reviewing documents alongside her, watching a picture emerge. That was worse than anything I'd expected, worse, I think, than even Daniel had fully processed himself. Diane's report landed on Judge Halloran's desk on a Thursday morning, and by that afternoon we were all back in the same courtroom, though the atmosphere had changed entirely. Daniel arrived without Preston Hale's usual swagger trailing behind him. He looked like a man who hadn't slept hollow around the eyes, his tailored suit somehow hanging differently on him than it had a week earlier. Diane took the stand first. She walked the court through her findings with the flat, methodical precision of someone who dealt in facts and had no interest in drama. In the 3 weeks between our father's death and the court hearing, Daniel had authorized 4 separate withdrawals from trust accounts that exceeded his interim executor authority, totaling just under $2 million. 2 of those withdrawals had gone toward covering a shortfall in Daniel's own real estate venture, a commercial development in Loudoun County that had run significantly over budget the previous year. The trust documents are explicit that interim executor authority is limited to operational expenses directly related to Collins Freight Solutions, Diane testified. These withdrawals were not operational. They were transfers to Collins Ridge Development LLC, a company wholly owned by Daniel Collins, unrelated to the family logistics business. Preston Hale objected, argued the transfers were loans temporary and fully intended to be repaid, standard practice for executors managing complex family finances. Diane didn't flinch. There's no loan agreement on file, no promissory note, no interest terms, no repayment schedule of any kind, she said. By any accounting standard, this constitutes unauthorized use of trust assets for personal benefit. She continued, there was more. Daniel had also used a Collins Freight commercial property, a warehouse facility in Baltimore, that was part of the trust's holdings as collateral for a private loan connected to the same development project, without board approval, without trustee authorization, without disclosing it to anyone. If that loan defaulted the family's actual operating business, the one Daniel claimed he was uniquely qualified to protect would have been directly exposed to seizure. I watched the judge's expression darken as Diane worked through the numbers. I watched Daniel's lawyer stop objecting somewhere around the 3rd violation because there was simply nothing left to argue. Then, Diane brought forward the piece that landed hardest. In the weeks immediately following our father's death. At the same time, Daniel was publicly telling board members that my inability to pay a few bills proved my incompetence. He had personally directed the freeze on my standard family distributions, the same modest monthly transfers our father had authorized years earlier to help offset the financial reality of a military salary in an expensive city. Those distributions weren't charity. They were part of the trust's standard operating provisions available to both of us equally. Daniel had frozen mine and continued drawing his own. He orchestrated the exact hardship he then used as evidence against her. Diane said plainly without embellishment, and I watched something shift across Judge Halloran's face, something that looked a great deal like disgust. I didn't say anything through any of this. I sat with my hands folded, watching my brother's carefully constructed narrative collapse in real time under the weight of documents. He probably assumed no one would ever examine that closely. There was no satisfaction in it, not really. Just a kind of exhausted clarity, the same feeling I got after a long deployment when the mission was finally definitively over. Judge Halloran didn't wait for closing arguments before addressing the room directly. "Mr. Collins," he said, and his voice had none of the polite neutrality from the first day of this hearing. You came into my courtroom asking me to grant you full and permanent control over a $36 million estate on the basis that your sister lacked the financial judgment to manage it responsibly. What this examination has revealed is a pattern of conduct that raises serious questions about your own fitness to serve in that role. Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't really. There was nothing left to say. Effective immediately, I am suspending Daniel Collins's authority as interim executor of the Collins Family Trust, pending a full investigation into potential breach of fiduciary duty, the judge continued. I'm referring the matter of the unauthorized transfers and the collateralized property to the appropriate authorities for further review. Given the documentation entered into evidence regarding Richard Collins's sealed letter and trust amendment, I am formally recognizing Victoria Collins as sole successor trustee of the Collins Family Trust, with full authority over all associated assets and holdings. The gavel came down, and it felt different from the sound I'd imagined during those 3 long weeks of dread, quieter, somehow less like an ending, and more like a door finally opening onto something that had been waiting behind it the whole time. Daniel sat frozen in his chair as the courtroom began to empty around him, staring at nothing the same way our father must have looked, I imagined, in whatever private moment he'd decided he could no longer trust his own son with everything he'd built. The courthouse steps were quiet by the time I walked out that afternoon, most of the reporters gone, the gray November sky pressing low over the city. I stood there for a moment before Daniel caught up to me, his footsteps uneven on the concrete, none of the confidence from 3 weeks earlier left in him at all. "Victoria!" I turned. He looked older than he had that first day in court, the kind of older that comes from finally seeing yourself the way everyone else has seen you for years. "I didn't know," he said, and stopped like he wasn't sure which part he meant. "About the letter, about any of it. I thought—" He shook his head. "I convinced myself you didn't understand what any of this was worth, that you'd walked away from it a long time ago and didn't have a right to any of it now." "I never wanted it, Daniel," I said, and I meant it. "Not the money, not the company. I wanted you to stop treating me like I was something to be managed instead of someone in this family." He didn't have an answer for that. He looked down at the steps at his own hands, the same hands that had signed transfer authorizations he never expected anyone to examine closely. In the weeks that followed, I didn't do what I think he genuinely expected me to do. I didn't remove him from the company entirely. I didn't erase his name from the building or freeze him out the way he'd frozen me out of the family accounts. What I did instead was order a full independent audit of every division of Collins Freight Solutions, not just the trust accounts Daniel had touched, but the entire operational structure top to bottom. I brought in an outside compliance team to review vendor contracts, employee protections, retirement funding, everything our father had built, and everything Daniel had layered on top of it in the years since. I wanted to know exactly what I was now responsible for protecting. I kept Daniel on as an operating executive, not because he'd earned unconditional trust back, but because our father had spent 4 decades believing in his instincts for growth, and something in me still believed that instinct hadn't disappeared just because it had been misused. I restructured his authority significantly. Every transaction above a modest threshold now required trustee approval. Every account was subject to quarterly independent review. He would never again have the kind of unsupervised access that let this happen in the first place, but he would still have a place in the company our father built if he chose to earn it honestly this time. The employees noticed the difference almost immediately. Retirement contributions that had quietly lapsed during the chaos of the estate dispute were reinstated within a month. A warehouse safety upgrade that had been delayed for budget reasons finally got funded. I sat down personally with the logistics managers in Baltimore, the same facility Daniel had nearly put at risk, and told them plainly what had happened and what would change. I didn't sugarcoat it. I think they respected that more than they would have respected a polished corporate statement. Daniel apologized to me properly only once, months later, not in a courtroom, not with lawyers present, just the two of us in what used to be our father's office, now mine. He sat across the desk that had belonged to our father for 30 years and said the words plainly without performance. "I'm sorry. For the courtroom, for freezing your accounts, For every year before that where I made you feel like you didn't belong in this family unless you did it my way. I let the silence sit there for a moment before I answered. You didn't lose because I'm a soldier, I told him. You lost because you never understood what Dad was actually trying to protect. He nodded slowly, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't argue with me. I went back to the Pentagon 2 weeks after the ruling, back to briefings and acquisition reviews, and the quiet, disciplined rhythm of a career I'd built entirely on my own terms, one nobody in my family had ever fully understood. I still oversee the trust from a distance, now monthly calls, with Diane's audit team quarterly reviews. With the new compliance officer, I installed decisions made carefully, and without the kind of ego that had almost cost this family everything. I think about my father often, especially in the quiet moments between deployments and briefings, in the strange stillness of a life split between two entirely different worlds. He never got to see how this ended. He never got to see Daniel's face when the letter was read aloud, or the warehouse workers in Baltimore getting their retirement funding restored, or his daughter standing in his old office making the kind of decisions he trusted her to make long before either of his children understood why. He saw something in me that I didn't fully see in myself for a long time, something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the quiet, consistent work of protecting what matters, without ever needing credit for it. That was never the lesson Daniel was ready to learn. Maybe he's learning it now. Maybe he isn't. Either way, I've stopped needing him to understand it in order to know it was true. Standing outside that courthouse the day it all ended, watching the gray sky settle over a city that had no idea what had just happened inside those walls, I understood something about my father I hadn't fully grasped before. He never doubted me, not once in all those years of silence and distance and misunderstanding. He was simply waiting patiently for the moment the truth would need to speak for itself. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and let me know if you've ever had a moment like Victoria's where the truth finally caught up to everyone at once. We share stories like this every single day, so if this one moved, you subscribe and stay close, because there's always another story waiting, and I don't want you to miss a single one of them.